Have you ever noticed how certain names in history feel almost bigger than life? Robert Francis Kennedy was one of those people. Even if you aren't deeply familiar with his story, you've likely heard of him. The boyish grin, the resonant voice, the tragic end. To his friends, colleagues, and admirers, he was simply Bobby. And yet, for all the familiarity, there are still layers to Bobby Kennedy that few truly understand. He was the determined younger brother pushing for social justice, the relentless political strategist who believed in a better America, sometimes in ways that ruffled powerful feathers. He was the caring soul who strove to heal a nation's wounds after his brother's assassination and then, all too soon, left the world on a wave of grief himself. Today, let's dive deep into the world of Robert F. Kennedy. This is more than a standard recounting of political milestones. It's an intimate exploration of a man whose short life changed the course of American history. We'll follow him from the innocent early years in a large, demanding family through the trials of war, triumphs of political battles, heartbreaks, controversies, and that final chapter which ended in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles. The story of Bobby Kennedy is about ambition, love, tragedy, and hope all at once. And in many ways, it's also about us, about what we expect from our leaders and from ourselves. The Kennedys were unlike most families of their day, or really any day for that matter. Led by the ambitious Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the household crackled with energy, discipline, and rivalry. As the seventh child of 9, Bobby was no stranger to the high-pressure environment in which the children were expected to excel. His father, Joe, had amassed a fortune in business and banking, and he was determined that his children would form a new American political dynasty. There was something about the Kennedys that set them apart, an almost regal presence combined with a relentless drive. Young Bobby found himself overshadowed at times by his older brothers, Joe Jr. and Jack. Bobby was smaller and quieter than his older brothers. He lacked some of the outward confidence that seemed to come so easily to Jack, but he had a spark, an earnestness, and a resilience that would eventually become his trademark. His Catholic upbringing gave him a strong sense of faith and moral responsibility. Family life was governed by his mother's strict discipline, daily prayers, structured meal times, and expectations of good manners. Yet beneath the polished exterior, he was also a child who craved connection and approval. He was particularly close to his mother, Rose, who sometimes called him her little baby. But even that closeness came with its share of pressure. One often overlooked detail from Bobby's youth is that he spent parts of his childhood in London when his father served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom from 1938 to 1940. At just 12 or 13, he found himself in the midst of a foreign city as Europe edged dangerously close to World War II. The threat of bombings, the tension in the air, those experiences shaped his worldview. He returned to the States with a more pronounced global perspective, something that would later influence his approach to foreign policy. He understood the seriousness of war and the fragility of peace. He also understood, probably more than most kids his age, that the world could change in an instant. When he came of age during World War II, Bobby wanted to serve. Enlisting in the Navy, he was assigned to the naval vessel USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., named after his brother Joe Jr., who had died in the war. Though Bobby's naval service did not involve frontline combat, the war's burden weighed heavily on him. He had already lost his beloved older brother, the family star, in a tragic airplane explosion during a top-secret mission. The family's illusions of invincibility cracked with that loss. And for Bobby, it was a searing initiation into adulthood, a harsh reminder that even the mighty Kennedys were not immune to suffering. After the war, Bobby returned stateside to attend Harvard, though by all accounts he was more diligent and earnest than brilliant in the classroom. He participated in sports, especially football, where he put that dogged determination to use. It was there that people started to notice he could inspire those around him, not by dazzling them with star power, but by his heart, by his refusal to back down from any challenge. He wasn't the biggest, fastest, or strongest player on the field, but he fought with passion. That became a recurring theme in his life. You didn't have to be the flashiest person in the room if you were the one with the most heart. If there's a lesser-known anecdote from his Harvard days that still resonates, it's the story of a chilly day on the football field when Bobby took a punishing hit that would send most players limping to the sidelines. Instead, he jumped right back up, face set with determination, shouting encouragement to his teammates. Those who witnessed it often spoke about how it was a glimpse of that intangible leadership quality he possessed. He made you want to follow him because you believed he would never give up on you or on the cause you shared. In 1950, he married Ethel Skakel, a union that would prove a cornerstone of his personal life. The two built a large family of their own, eventually welcoming 11 children. As a father, Bobby was known to be both playful and deeply affectionate, a man who rarely hesitated to take his children on adventures, horseback riding, football in the yard, sailing, and laughter-filled dinners. Amid the swirl of public life, he tried to ground himself in the love of family, and Ethel, equally strong-willed and vivacious, stood by him through victories and trials alike. Their home was often full of friends, staff members, and extended relatives, a scene reminiscent of his childhood. Yet, for all the privilege and resources at their disposal, they also shared moments of heartbreak and stress. Being a Kennedy meant your private moments were never truly private, and tragedies often played out beneath the nation's watchful eyes. Bobby's entrance into the political arena came courtesy of his older brother's rising star. John F. Kennedy launched a campaign for the U.S. Senate in 1952, and Bobby threw himself wholeheartedly into managing the campaign. Though he and Jack were close in age, just 8 years apart, the lines of command were clear. Jack was the candidate, the front man, the one with the charismatic smile that could charm entire crowds, while Bobby was the behind-the-scenes strategist, fiercely loyal and unafraid to do the dirty work of politics. He had a certain relentlessness, a willingness to knock on doors, call up supporters at odd hours, and keep staffers in line. He famously made an impression as a no-nonsense operator who would push as hard as necessary to get results. One lesser-known episode from that Senate campaign involved Bobby tracking down a key local leader in a small Massachusetts town. The man had seemed lukewarm about endorsing Jack. Bobby spent hours with him, sharing stories, listening to the man's fears about the future, eventually persuading him to back Jack publicly. Later, campaign insiders recalled how that endorsement helped turn the tide in a crucial local election district. Bobby's approach was personal, determined, and unrelenting. In that moment, he discovered a knack for forging genuine bonds with potential allies, something he would use again in national politics. Jack's victory in the Senate race validated the family's dreams. The Kennedy political machine was gaining steam, and Bobby's own ambitions began to crystallize. After working as a lawyer in the U.S. Department of Justice, he quickly rose to prominence, tackling cases related to labor racketeering. He became chief counsel to the Senate Rackets Committee, earning a reputation as a tough interrogator, especially when it came to organized crime. If you see archival footage of Bobby grilling union leaders like Jimmy Hoffa, you'll notice his stern, unflinching gaze, the sharp cross-examination style, and an almost moral fervor. Some found him sanctimonious, others saw a champion of justice, but no one could deny he was making waves. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he appointed Bobby as Attorney General. Critics cried nepotism, but the move also felt inevitable. Who else could the newly elected president trust more than his own brother? Bobby took the position with characteristic zeal. He intensified the federal government's war on organized crime, focusing on mob bosses who had thrived on political corruption. Under Bobby's direction, the Justice Department indicted a host of high-profile figures. Organized crime convictions went up dramatically. It wasn't just a job, it was a moral crusade. In speeches, Bobby often spoke about the responsibility of public servants to protect the innocent from exploitation and violence. These were not just words for him. He genuinely believed in using the power of government to champion the underdog. Yet his tenure as Attorney General wasn't just about fighting the mob. Bobby was also an influential voice on civil rights. The 1960s were a tinderbox of racial tensions. Segregation was still the law in parts of the American South. Civil rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr. were leading nonviolent protests to end Jim Crow laws, and the movement demanded federal action. President Kennedy was often cautious, wary of alienating Southern Democrats. Bobby, on the other hand, sometimes displayed a bolder willingness to act. When freedom riders, those courageous black and white activists who rode buses into segregated Southern states, faced arrests and brutal violence, Bobby used federal authority to protect them. It wasn't an easy balance, though. On one hand, he had to maintain the political coalitions that kept his brother in office. On the other, his conscience told him the nation had a moral obligation to ensure equality for all citizens. Some lesser-discussed anecdotes highlight his evolution on civil rights. Early in his political life, Bobby had been somewhat dismissive of the movement's urgency, believing the courts could handle the issue slowly over time. But personal encounters changed him. One account recalls a meeting where a group of young black activists challenged Bobby to consider the daily humiliations they endured under segregation. Their emotional testimonies seemed to pierce his lawyerly defenses, and from then on, he took a more direct approach. He arranged for Martin Luther King Jr. to be released from jail in Georgia. He sent federal marshals to protect James Meredith when he enrolled at the University of Mississippi, facing violent backlash. His transformation wasn't instantaneous nor without flaws, but by 1963, he was a firm ally of civil rights in the halls of power. Then came November 22, 1963, one of the darkest days in American history. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. For Bobby, it was more than the loss of a president. It was the loss of his beloved brother, the man he had lived and breathed politics with for over a decade. The shock and grief ran so deep that those who saw him in the immediate aftermath described him as a man haunted. The myth of the Kennedy family invincibility shattered once again. In those first days, Bobby retreated into himself, tormented by questions of how, why, and what he could have done differently to protect Jack. According to close friends, he wasn't just mourning, he was questioning the entire meaning of the work they had done together. President Lyndon B. Johnson took the reins of power, and though Bobby remained Attorney General for a time, the relationship between him and LBJ was fraught with tension. Johnson, an astute politician from Texas, had never gotten along well with Bobby, whose brand of moral fervor and personal loyalty to Jack sometimes manifested as distrust for LBJ's more pragmatic style. In the months after JFK's death, Bobby was deeply depressed. Ethel and his children did their best to support him, but he was in an existential crisis. The spotlight was on him, though, and many in the nation saw Bobby as the standard bearer for Kennedy ideals. Eventually, in September 1964, Bobby left the Johnson administration and ran for the U.S. Senate from New York, a move some saw as opportunistic. Johnson himself was reportedly displeased, feeling Bobby was using his brother's legacy to catapult into a position of power. Yet for Bobby, it was a chance to carve out his own path, to continue the work of advancing social justice and bridging cultural divides. His Senate campaign was notable for its sincerity, particularly when Bobby ventured into impoverished neighborhoods, showing genuine concern for the plight of the poor. One might recall the time he visited migrant farm workers in upstate New York, listening intently to their stories of low wages and terrible living conditions. Bobby won the Senate seat and quickly championed issues that were often overlooked: poverty, racial injustice, and the need for America to live up to its founding ideals. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War was escalating under President Johnson. Bobby was initially cautious about outright opposing the war, partly due to loyalty to the Democratic Party and partly because of the complex geopolitics at play. However, as the body counts rose and public opinion began to shift, he grew more outspoken. By 1967, he had become a prominent critic of the war, questioning its moral justification and strategic wisdom. It was around this period that his personal transformation became even more pronounced. Where once he had been seen as the ruthless runt of the Kennedy family, a behind-the-scenes enforcer, he was now seen by many as a champion of the downtrodden. Cameras captured him hugging children in impoverished parts of Mississippi. He walked through the crumbling tenements of Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, talking directly with residents about their struggles. He visited Native American reservations, appalled at the conditions he saw. And in these moments, one could sense that Bobby's empathy was genuine. Activists who had initially distrusted him because he came from wealth and privilege felt something shift as they spoke with him. One of the rarely recounted stories from his Senate years involves a late-night meeting with a group of student activists protesting the Vietnam War. Bobby had invited them to his home. They expected a politician's canned lines, but instead found a man grappling openly with his own moral uncertainties. He challenged them to understand how decisions had to be made within the constraints of a complex government. But he also acknowledged that they were right to be outraged if they believed the war was unjust. This willingness to engage in honest, sometimes raw dialogue was becoming a Bobby Kennedy trademark. His campaign rallies were electric. Whether he was speaking to black communities in Watts, white Appalachian coal miners, or college students brimming with anti-establishment fervor, Bobby managed to strike a chord. He spoke of uniting America's two worlds, the wealthy and the impoverished, the privileged and the marginalized. He believed that empathy could bridge political divides. That belief seemed to surge through the crowds like a pulse. There was a sense of momentum as he racked up primary victories, none more symbolic than his win in California on June 4th, 1968. Then came the early morning hours of June 5th, 1968. Bobby had just finished giving his victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He walked through the hotel's kitchen to greet staff and supporters. In an instant, the bright future that so many believed in was snuffed out. Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian immigrant angered by Bobby's stance on the Middle East, fired shots that fatally wounded the senator. America watched in horror as the hope that had been kindled abruptly collapsed into another wave of national mourning. Bobby Kennedy died the following day. The shock was immeasurable. Many Americans had not even recovered from the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. just 2 months earlier. Now the sense of tragedy and disbelief was overwhelming. People wept in the streets. A funeral train carried his body from New York to Washington, with thousands lining the tracks to pay their respects, reminiscent of Abraham Lincoln's funeral train a century before. The images of men, women, and children standing tearfully by the railroad tracks still haunt the collective memory of the nation. In the years since his death, historians have debated Robert F. Kennedy's legacy. Some argue that he was a complex figure whose earlier support of controversial tactics against communism and unwavering loyalty to JFK overshadowed his later humanitarian efforts. Others see him as a man who experienced a genuine moral awakening, who learned from his mistakes, and who might have led America into a more compassionate era had he lived. The controversies surrounding his leadership style, particularly during his time as Attorney General, continue to elicit strong opinions. Did he overstep ethical boundaries in pursuing the mob? Was his feud with Lyndon Johnson purely personal, or did it reflect legitimate ideological differences? And then there are the whispered rumors of whether or not he had knowledge about covert intelligence operations linked to his brother's presidency. Some conspiracies point to differences with the CIA or the Mafia, painting Bobby as a man who made dangerous enemies. No matter where you stand, one thing seems clear. Bobby Kennedy's life and untimely death carried monumental implications for America's cultural and political trajectory. He championed civil rights at a time when doing so risked losing political capital. He challenged the establishment on Vietnam, potentially altering the course of that conflict had he lived to become president. Moreover, his relentless war against organized crime gave future attorneys general a blueprint for federal law enforcement's role in combating powerful criminal networks. Even beyond politics, his focus on poverty set the stage for deeper discussions about income inequality, an issue that resonates loudly to this day. Then there's the deeper historical puzzle. What if Bobby Kennedy had lived and won the presidency? It's a question that has enthralled what-if historians for decades. Would Vietnam have ended sooner? Would racial tensions have eased under his watch, or would they have ignited further conflicts among those who resisted civil rights progress? Might the 1970s have been a time of unity rather than division? It's impossible to say for certain, but what's clear is that Bobby seemed poised to ride a wave of popular support that cut across many demographic lines, a rare feat in American politics then and now. Even on the global stage, his approach to foreign policy was nuanced. He was no pacifist, but he viewed diplomacy and genuine engagement with disadvantaged nations as part of America's moral duty. During his Senate trips abroad, he made a point of visiting remote villages and meeting ordinary people. This focus on the human aspect of foreign affairs might have redefined America's role in the world had he taken the Oval Office. One could speculate that his presidency would have more heavily emphasized international cooperation, human rights, and possibly a quicker path to détente with the Soviet Union. Again, these are the unanswered questions that hover around Bobby Kennedy's legacy like ghosts, reminding us of history's fragile if-then moments. As we end this journey through Robert F. Kennedy's life, let's carry forward the questions and visions he so powerfully articulated. Who do we become when confronted with adversity? How do we honor the memory of those we lose? And what does it mean to seek justice for those who have none? If Bobby taught us anything, it might be that for all our human failings, we are capable of reaching beyond ourselves if we have the courage to dream things that never were and to ask, why not? That is the legacy of Robert Francis Kennedy, a man of privilege who strove to be the champion of the underprivileged, a man hardened by tragedy who fought for hope in a life that ended too soon, leaving us with both heartbreak and inspiration. May we take from his story the courage to care deeply, to venture boldly, and to remember that in the darkest times, empathy and moral conviction can light the path forward. In that sense, Bobby Kennedy's story is far from over. It continues each time we look at the world's injustices. And rather than shrug our shoulders, we stand up and say, why not make it better? And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.